you very much, Katie, for that speech. We'll now go back to our paper speakers and back to proposition. Speaking next is Asha Abeyasekera. She's a lecturer at the Centre for Women's Studies at the University of York. Her research interests include marriage and kinship, honour and homemaking, and morality, emotions, and personhood. She is the author of Making the Right Choice, Narratives of Marriages in Sri Lanka. Asha, you have the house.
So any debate about marriage cannot happen without a discussion about gender. Gender is one of the primary cultural frames for organizing social relations. Now, we all know that gender is a social system not only of difference, but of inequality. When feminist anthropologists began writing in the 1970s, they wanted to understand the subordination of women. Many of them focused on marriage because it seemed to play a crucial role in subordinating wives to husbands by rendering alternatives to marriage untenable. They observed how marriage was crucial for structuring female as well as male experiences and subjectivities. Their approach was to treat gender not as the cause of marriage, but to analyze gender as the product of marriage. Now, I want to underscore that I'm referring here to heterosexual marriage and marriage as an inherently heteronormative structure, a point I will pick up later. Analyzing gender as the product of marriage revealed that the roots of gender inequality are embedded within the institution of marriage and its related institutions of kinship, family, household, and home. What does it mean to say that gender is a product of marriage? First, that our primary gender identities are ascribed to us within the institution of marriage, kinship and family, girl and boy, woman and man, map onto daughter and son, sister and brother. Second, we are socialized into gender roles on the gendered models that marriage present, which is mother and father and husband and wife. Thirdly, marriage is the primary site of the gender division of labor. Across the world, the labor that's required to sustain the marital household has been divided on the basis of gender, with women as wives and mothers taking on the responsibility for household maintenance, childcare, and other caring responsibilities. The stark reality of the persistence of the gender division of labor became apparent during the COVID-19 crisis, when it was revealed that across the world, the responsibility and burden of care was disproportionately held by women. Now, what makes marriage an inherently oppressive institution is not only that marriage reinforces the gender division of labor, but that this labor is undervalued, which is exemplified in the ongoing debates of the unpaid care work and the unpaid labor of social reproduction. Household work, as we know, despite what clean influencers might tell us on Instagram, saps women's energies, and when undervalued and unacknowledged, it undermines women's sense of dignity and self-worth. We also know through countless research studies that this unequal division of labor that marriage imposes on women often result in women earning less. Women's care roles must more often than not inhibit their chances of career progression, which results in women being less financially independent, and marriage therefore directly impacts the status and position of women, both within marriage and outside of it. This brings me back to my original assertion that marriage is not the product of gender, but rather that gender, specifically gender inequality, is the product of marriage. Now, I anticipate that some of my colleagues on the opposition will argue that with the transformation of gender identities away from its binary construction has the potential for transforming gender roles and the gender division of labor. While our understanding and experience of gender identities have indeed radically changed in the last decades, I would argue that these changes have not and cannot transform an institution whose blueprint is heteronormative ideologies. Even within same-sex marriage, where gender identities do not map onto binary identities of husband and wife, the labor a couple must exert on behalf of the household continues to be refracted through the normative lens of gender and gender roles, and therefore unequally valued. This point about the gender of value or the gender dimensions of the way in which we assign value to persons is an important finding in my own research into marriage within the middle class and later the working classes in Sri Lanka. I found that marriage exerts moral power over men and women. Moral becoming is only possible by fulfilling one's gendered roles of mother and father, wife and husband, and for women, the production of home. People's sense of value, their sense of virtue, and their sense of self-worth, I found, are structured through marriage with very few alternative routes to achieve moral personhood. Now, this has several serious consequences. I do not want to quote the numerous statistics on the widespread prevalence of gender-based violence across the world. What is critical is that domestic violence is the most common form of violence against women. These forms that domestic violence take, especially within the realm of intimate partner violence, sexual coercion and assault, bodily harm, emotional manipulation, psychological abuse, financial control, demonstrate the unequal power relations that are inherent to the institution of marriage. And I want to emphasize here that domestic violence is not unique to the so-called traditional societies and certain cultural practices, but are prevalent across geopolitical and class divides. My research demonstrates that one of the main reasons for women tolerating domestic violence is the moral power that marriage exerts. Women endure the constraints, the coercion, and control that marriage exerts because they have internalized the idea that marriage, family, and home are the only sites that offer the possibility of achieving moral personhood. The monastery perhaps is the only other option. The continuing prevalence of domestic violence underscores the third point I want to make tonight, that marriage constructs women as property. We've heard this before. Feminists have argued that it is through marriage that men and patriarchy ensure the continuity of the social order and the reproduction of their social selves. In fact, the core theories that explain kinship and marriage view heterosexuality, the gender division of labor, and gender inequality as the invariant core of the domestic domain. Women are natural resources to be used by men in their project of creating and maintaining culture. These marital concepts of entitlement and ownership of women's bodies linger on today despite sweeping changes that have undergone in terms of marriage laws. So the gender of value also radiates out from the domestic domain into patriarchal projects, namely nationalism, where the gendered body of the nurturing mother and the virtuous wife become the site of nation building, as we have witnessed very recently in Making America Great Again. I want to emphasize here how the gender of value crafted within the institution of marriage radiates out to assign value to even those of us women who have rejected marriage and children. Okay? Let's recall J.D. Vance's vile comment. He called Democratic politicians a bunch of childless cat ladies with miserable lives. He later defended himself. He was not criticizing people who do not have children, but the Democratic Party for being anti-family and anti-children, read anti-marriage. My point here is that Vance's comment, childless cat ladies, not childless dog gentlemen, exemplifies how the gender of value originates within marriage and family and exerts what Claire Chambers terms symbolic violence. One particularly pernicious form of this is when women are made to feel inferior, worthless, flawed, and even a failure if they do not marry or have a date for Valentine's Day. This brings me to my final point. Marriage as an institution has endured into the 21st century because it holds the promise of companionship and belonging, stability, and continuity. During the sexual revolution of the 1960s, the demand to dismantle the patriarchal state and imperialism went hand in hand with dismantling marriage, the bourgeois family, and conjugal sexuality. Yes?
So, you've basically made the point that, historically marriage has caused gender inequality, and, you seem to be someone that's sort of been able to acknowledge the existence of this inequality, this socially constructed reality of marriage, and you're able to free yourself from this, right? So what's stopping you from maybe finding someone that has also been able to free themselves of this socially constructed reality, maybe as a man, for example, and entering a relationship with that person.
Oh, you are assuming that I have freed myself of the burden of marriage. No, I have not. I don't think any of us can. Because that's what I'm trying to say, that the hold that marriage exerts, even when you're single, it exerts control by telling me that if I'm not married, that I'm not as good as a person who is married. That was my point. Okay? So Laurent Bellin tells us that desire was placed at the central of this political upheaval. Okay? But this was but a moment in feminist utopian thinking. Desire's irregularity, its excess, and its incoherence has been met with and overtaken by the coercive and reductive forms of propriety, virtue, and discipline that marriage exerts. We are told that the institution of marriage teaches us impulse control, guards against hedonism, and inculcates the virtue of loyalty, patience, and endurance, as this gentleman said, as exemplified in Jesus' life. In exchange for disciplining our desire, marriage promises to fulfill our yearning for intimacy, for discovering and expressing our authentic selves, and eventually our happiness. I'm here to tell you that this is a false promise. Marriage is inherently an oppressive institution. Thank you.